All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Tutors, continuing our journey through genetics. And today we are going to be looking at sex-linked traits and how that is going to end up making a difference in our inheritance patterns for our different alleles. So, our learning targets for the day. First learning target is, well, to be able to understand the difference between autosomes and sex chromosomes. So not all chromosomes are exactly alike. There are going to be some differences, and we categorize them in these two different ways, autosomes and sex chromosomes. And then we're going to look at being able to identify inheritance patterns for these sex-linked traits. What's going on when our genes are on a sex chromosome? So when we think about this, if you have Drosophila, these are our different flies right here. Drosophila happen to have 8 total chromosomes. For 6 of those chromosomes, both males and females have those 6 different chromosomes. They are 3 different pairs of chromosomes, and they are referred to as being autosomal chromosomes. But there's another set of chromosomes, and they are specific to the biological sex of the Drosophila. In this case, these are both X chromosomes, which means that our Drosophila would be a female. If it was not 2 X chromosomes, but it was an X and a Y chromosome, then our Drosophila would be a male. So that is how the sex chromosomes work. 2 X chromosomes would be a biological female for the Drosophila, and an X and a Y is a biological male. And if we were to look at when you're doing a cross of Drosophila, you would see that if you were to cross both a male and a female Drosophila, our anticipation is that we would have 50-50 split between the males and the females. And the reason for this is very straightforward. If we set this up as a Punnett square, we would see that the female with the 2 X's and the male with the X and the Y, if we brought it across and brought down, filling in our Punnett square, we see that 50% of our Punnett square would show up to be females and 50% would appear as male. And that's why we would anticipate phenotypically that we would have 50% of our offspring as being female and 50% of our offspring as being male. Continuing with this, now we're going to look a little bit deeper at it. When we did a cross a long time ago in the early 1900s, it ended up that we saw that in our cross, 75% of the offspring had these red eyes, which is the normal eye color that we anticipated seeing. But 25% of the offspring had white eyes. And that was really interesting because of the 25% that had white eyes, we would have anticipated that 50% of those would have been male and 50% of those would have been female. But what turned out to be the case was that 100% of the white-eyed individuals were male. There was not a single white-eyed female. So 0% of the females had white eyes. All the females had red eyes. And the white eyes only appeared in the males. And that means that we now need to look at this and think about what conclusions we can make. So analyzing. First off, the trait was not expressed in the parent generation. And since the trait was not expressed in the parent generation, but then it showed up in the F1 generation, that reveals to us that it must have been a recessive trait because it was masked and then it appeared. Next, we recognize that the trait appeared disproportionately in the males to the females, 100% in the males compared to 0% in the females. There was a very big difference between the two different sexes. And so that leads us to believe that it must have been involving sex chromosomes. It must have either involved the X or the Y. The gene for eye color, being red or white, must be on one of those 2 sex chromosomes. our white-eyed male somehow got the allele for white eyes. And where did that allele come from? Did it come from the female parent, or did it come from the male parent? Now, we know that we had two different alleles, one allele for red eyes and one allele for white eyes. And we also know that the alleles had to have been found on the X chromosome. Now, how do we know that the alleles had to be on the X chromosome? Well, because the male parent didn't have white eyes. And if the male parent didn't express white eyes, it couldn't have been on the Y chromosome, because then it would have expressed white eyes. And if it was on the X chromosome of that male, then it also would have expressed white eyes. So that means that the female parent must have been heterozygous. You see, the male parent can't be heterozygous because the male parent has only one X chromosome. And the X and the Y, they don't have the same genes. There are different genes on those two different chromosomes. So the only way you could have a heterozygous parent with the sex chromosomes is if it's with the female parent. And so our female parent here, we can see it has both the dominant red eye allele, but also the recessive white-eyed allele. And that's why the female parent has red eyes, because of that dominant red allele. But when she passed on that chromosome to her male offspring, and that's how we ended up with a white-eyed male, where it had the recessive allele upon the X chromosome and nothing on the Y chromosome, because the Y chromosome has different genes on it. And this leads us to some important information. First off, sex-linked traits, they're not going to occur in equal proportions in both sexes. It's going to occur more often in males than it will in females. And the one we were just looking at was X-linked recessive. And that's the recessive allele that happens to be on the X chromosome. In that case, the white-eyed trait appeared more often in the males than it occurred in the females, because the males couldn't be heterozygous. They only have one of that specific chromosome, and thus they only have one version of that gene. So they will show that trait. The red eyes, though, they were X-linked dominant. And what we can see from that is that the males, if the male happens to have that dominant allele, they will always pass that allele to their female offspring, because the male is going to pass on its X chromosome to its female offspring. The females, on the other hand, well, they may pass on the trait, they may not, because the female may be heterozygous or they be homozygous dominant. And if the trait is Y-linked, that means that it's going to only show up in the males, and that the male parent will always pass that trait on to the male offspring. And those are sex-linked traits, leading us to could you end up with a white-eyed female? And in fact, you can. The way it would have to work, though, is that our female parent that had red eyes would have had to have been heterozygous, and we would have had to have had a white-eyed male. In that case, we can end up with a homozygous recessive female offspring, which would then have white eyes. So in summary of all of this, these alleles, they're linked to the sex chromosomes. We include those chromosomes when we're doing our Punnett squares so we don't confuse ourselves. We don't want to end up writing a male as being heterozygous, because a male can only have, for an X-linked trait, one of that specific gene. And we need to be sure to treat sex-linked traits different from autosomal traits. That's why we write down the chromosome as well as a symbol for the allele all together. And typically, these sex-linked traits lend to themselves to have an unequal distribution amongst the different biological sexes. More often than not, these traits will show up in males than they will show up in females, because the males can't be heterozygous. They cannot mask the recessive allele. And that is sex-linked traits. So until next time, Be awesome. Stay awesome.